Good morning. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here in Sangdo. My country is known for history, culture, palaces, Taj Mahal, but really not for its cities. In fact, in India, there's almost an urban crisis of sorts, and that's why our government has declared a mission to have 100 smart cities in India. So for me to be here and to actually interact with all of you, some of the biggest thinkers, innovators in the urban space, is an absolute delight. And I would like to now welcome my panelists. Jonathan Ballon, Vice President and General Manager, Internet of Things from Intel. Big round of applause for Jonathan. He is responsible for managing and driving revenue across a portfolio of growth segments. I interacted with him last evening and found out that he's very, very passionate about how technology can bring about the change.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? In
yes.
our cities. All right, Jonathan, welcome. Please take your seat. Also with us is Howard Bamsey, Executive Director of Green Climate Fund. He's also known as Ambassador Bamsey because he's been representative of his country and has spent a substantial part of his career in international diplomacy. And of course, a very well-known negotiator for UN climate change.
Thanks, Manisha.
Welcome.
And I live in
Great.
Songdo.
Oh, you live in Sangdo. Josué Tanaka is our next speaker. Let me welcome him as well, Director for Energy Efficiency and Climate Change at EBRD. He is responsible for operational strategy and the planning function, and of course, really opening the purse strings for any of the green work which is happening.
Absolutely.
Welcome.
Good morning.
Vatsal Bhatt is our next panelist. He's the Director for NewCities and Neighborhood Development for US Green Building Council. And Vatsal will give us some good information on what USGBC is planning to do.
Thanks for being here.
In terms of measurements. Today, the attempt of this panel will be to find out whether you can have measurable, standardized measurements for well-being. Can they be replicable across the globe, across the world? Or they have to be region-specific? How many parameters do you really include in well-being? Because for everybody here in the room, if I were to ask you, or you, each one of you would have a different parameter of well-being. For someone, it'll be prosperity. For someone, it'll be equitable growth. However, the panel's effort will be to come to a conclusion and say, yes, it's possible, or no, it's not possible, and what do we do with it? Before I begin, though, I would like to hand over the mic or the spotlight to each of my panelists, starting with you, Jonathan. Tell us, what has been Intel's contribution to making our cities more thriving?
Sure. First, let me start by saying, I've spent my life's work using technology, applied technology, to help improve people's lives, whether it be in healthcare or in education or in safety. And that work continues at Intel. We have an umbrella philosophy around this idea of the Internet of Things, which is IoT for life. And how can you apply technology in these areas to make our communities safer, to reduce our reliance upon fossil fuels, to improve healthcare, and we're investing in technologies to make our physical environments more efficient and safer. Most notably and recently, investments in autonomous driving, which will not only improve the safety of our cities, they will be more efficient in mobility and getting from point A to point B, whether it be people or goods, and in the process, reducing the amount of CO2 emissions that are produced in the process.
And many more exciting things lined up.
Lots of things that hopefully we'll talk about during this panel.
Okay. Howard Bamsey, what about you? You've been known as one of the key negotiators for UN climate change. Was it heartbreaking when Mr. Trump actually decided that he doesn't care for the Paris Agreement and withdrew from it?
Well, I need to go back a step too. I've spent most of my life, and am again, as a civil servant. And civil servants, to many people's horror, seldom make comments about contentious political questions or the headlines of the news. But what we do is set frameworks help develop rules, and in that way help make things happen. And our panel today is looking at standards and well-being, and I think I'd like to make a case for getting started on the process. You asked about parameters. How many are there on well-being? We don't know. But I'd like to make a case that there's an argument for starting with climate change, because it's really important in cities. Cities are really important to the planet's response to climate change, and we can measure, and we've come some distance in measuring, acquiring the data, and in measuring the impacts and responses to climate change. The Compact of Mayors, for example, has a methodology already started. So I think if we're going to talk about well-being and setting standards for well-being in cities, it might be worth thinking about whether starting with climate might not be a useful way of starting to build a framework, the sorts of things that public servants do.
All right. Okay. We'll delve into it in more detail. Mr. Tanaka.
Well, I think Jonathan mentioned technology, right, in his life. In my case, I'm very happy to be here because my own initial call was very much in cities. Particularly, I would say, what was presented just before we went on stage on public transport, on essentially thinking that, if you can improve, an epsilon on the life of everybody that's moving, in cities, commuting every day, you're actually having already, a big impact. But the same way that Jonathan mentioned technology, in my case, I focused on finance, because finance, in a way, is one of the elements, that can convert ideas into practical realities implemented. And therefore, my approach, if you want, to the question that you've asked, is very much to say, what are the standards that we take into account in defining the projects that we will then finance and that will contribute to the improvement of urban well-being, right? And therefore, as a bank, we finance roughly in the space that Howard mentioned, in other words, improvement of energy efficiency, renewable energy, about $3 billion a year, out of which a big share of that is actually invested in cities, right? And it is there. I will not give the answer yet to how many indicators, but I will answer in the next round.
All right. Vatsal Bhatt, you're attempting a large thing at US Green Building Council, taking standardization beyond buildings, isn't it?
Sure. And I think many of you know about US Green Building Council and its leadership in sustainability, starting with buildings, that they started almost 23 years ago. And now, initially, their discussion, as Manisha, you talked about, whether it's need to be regional or so, initially their discussion about green buildings was US focused. And many of you know that now USGBC has taken it globally. It's available in more than 165 countries and all. So I think with that background, we have learned quite a bit over the process. And so right now, what USGBC has been doing in the build space is quite interesting. So at the building scale, they had been talking about sustainability and well-being for the building, for people who occupy them, live there, and so on and so forth. So that is a key part of it. But now USGBC is taking that discussion further to communities and cities. So we are right now talking about certifying cities overall for their sustainability, well-being, as well as infrastructure. So
there is an attempt.
There is an attempt right now.
At bringing about some standardization.
USGBC has started a new certification on December 1st, 2016, called Lead for Cities and Lead for Communities. And there is an attempt in which we are talking about basic parameters, like trying to compare cities across the board, across world cities, trying to compare them over energy, water, waste, transportation, and human experience. We all feel, we live in cities and all. So that includes prosperity you were talking about, equitability, health and safety, as well as education are key part of it.
So here's the question.
Go ahead.
Already, Vatsal has drilled out 12 criteria and parameters. So what are these criteria? How many do you involve? Human experience is not a quantitative material, right? It is qualitative. And it's so hard to capture. So my question to the panel, and the first one will be, how many of those criteria do you involve? Is it prosperity, equitable growth, transport, education? The gamut is just so large, Jonathan. What would you pick? I mean,
Well-
I would pick a good night's sleep. How many people are not insomniacs in a city? If largest number of people are sleeping well that night, would be my criteria. But what's yours?
Well, I would say I'd first start with the fact that obviously measurement is important because you can't manage or change anything that you don't measure. It's why I weigh myself in the morning every day. But seriously, I think the answer to the question is highly variable because it depends on the city and the city's priorities. In some cities, the most pressing issue is air quality because it's impacting the health and lives of adults and children. It's
My city.
7 million people a year dying from air pollution issues around the world. 600,000 of them are children. So for some cities, that could be the number one issue. In others, it's community safety and security and keeping citizens safe. So I think having a framework for how we measure these things is important. Perhaps more important is having the standards so that when we are reflecting on various city priorities, we can make a relative assessment. And what's going to be key to that is those standards is having some equally distributed access to technology. And in order to measure anything, we need access to data. So it starts with how do we get access to the data?
Right.
How do we have standards around that data so that we can measure appropriately, and then let the cities decide on which things are most important to them, and it will be a journey.
All right. Mr. Tanaka, would you agree with Jonathan that yes, it can be measured, it can be standardized, but for every city, it could be different weightages, right? For some cities, something would be more important, for other cities. So you've got to adapt it for regions and for cities?
Yeah, let's say, first of all, I couldn't agree more on the issue of the measurement. So just to show you in terms of practical terms, how we proceed. Essentially, in our case, because of the specific focus we have put on the environmental dimension of urban well-being, we have launched an initiative called Green Cities Action Plan. And it relates very much to what Jonathan mentioned in practice in every one of the close to 200 cities that we work with. Essentially, we've came up with a first definition of 35 environmental indicators. Now, I mention environmental because, as we saw from the first panel this morning, the notions of urban well-being go well beyond just environmental. You have social elements, you have political participation, security, but in our case, we focused on that environmental element, which links also to what Howard mentioned, for example, about carbon emission reduction, of the role of cities in that, or the impact, how do cities deal with climate change impacts that are already happening today. So out of these 35 indicators, we get the data. So that is the first part that Jonathan mentioned. The second part is really a hard part in which you essentially analyze against benchmarks, right? So we've worked with a number of international organizations to get the benchmarks for air quality, get the benchmarks for water quality, get the benchmarks on solid waste management. And then I would say the real hard part with the cities, because I very much agree with your point, it's the cities, each city that needs to decide for itself, is essentially to identify what are the priorities. Because in financial terms, all cities generally have 10, 20, 50 times the number of ideas that they can afford, right? And therefore, somebody, you need to find what is essentially realistic in terms of financial capacity of the cities. That means priorities. And essentially, we try to have this essentially data-driven and also, participatory process. It cannot just be one technocrat in a city hall that decides, what is going to be done. So essentially, that's the process that we follow that leads to the identification of specific projects, which are then financed.
So there is merit. What you're saying is there's so much merit in measuring well-being, because that also opens up funding for the cities and helps funders like you to choose projects.
Absolutely, but I would say again, the big, the most important here is really this determination of the priorities by each of the cities by themselves. We help technically, we can then help financially, but there are a lot of difficult choices, again, because most cities do not have the means to finance all the ideas that they have.
Absolutely.
Right? And therefore, working out, which project is going to be first, for example, when you have 10 environmental problems, is part of the work that we do with cities.
Mr. Bamsey, what would you say in terms of prioritizing? So climate change is, of course, the beginning, because cities are adding the most to carbon emissions, and they're quite aware of it, the problem that they have in terms of all air quality, the water purity, etc. But do you have any thoughts in terms of when cities are prioritizing within the framework of climate, what should be number one? Should air be number one?
I think we've already agreed with your argument, really, essentially, that cities are all going to be different, and as Josué said, they're going to have different priorities. But I'm a pretty pragmatic person, and it seems to me if we're looking for standards, it's really important just to get started, just to get moving, just to prove the concept that you can do standards. And as Jonathan said, you can't measure anything without data. And you need to know what's happening. And I think climate change provides a good example of, particularly at the cities level, because of what the Compact of Mayors is already doing globally with hundreds of cities. They've provided a platform for collecting data in a consistent manner and in a transparent way. And that's essential if you're talking about standards, because while cities have different priorities, and that reflects their own circumstances and their concept of well-being, their focus of well-being, there are some things that are in common. I think climate is one of them. All cities have particular vulnerabilities to climate change. Coastal cities have really pointed ones, and they're going to have to respond in a really thorough way very quickly. But all cities, there's an argument, for example, some research shows that cities may suffer much greater increases in temperature than other parts of the planet. And the heat island effect is already well known. That will compound with climate change. So we've got a real argument for cities responding to climate. Cities matter because 85% of GDP is already produced in cities. 2/3 of people will live in cities before too long. So if we're going to save the planet, start with cities. Okay. So we've got to that point. Then you've got the data already being acquired. You can start to develop a framework for standards in that way and just get started.
Where you're speaking from is so alien to a country like India. There is no data. There are no priorities in cities. So there are many challenges to get started with Jonathan.
Well, I mean, we're talking about things obviously on a global basis now with the Paris Accord, and despite what some people may believe, data is apolitical. Data is objective, and if you can't convince people on a global stage, absolutely at a local level, you can drive change. And what we're seeing here in the last week or so in the US are state and local governments rising up to respond to the global imperative, but doing it at a local level. And while cities may not be able to solve the global problem individually, objectively, they can solve their local problems, right? And whether that's impacting their own emissions, improving their own air or water quality, their own security or whatever. That's undeniable, and that will happen. And the economics behind it, beyond just the altruistic survival instinct to pursue these initiatives around wellness, is that the reality is that fossil fuels are more scarce.
Yes.
They're more expensive to produce, and businesses and governments economically will be forced and are adopting renewables.
So there are economic benefits.
Absolutely.
Right.
And if you look at the state, just one final point, if you look at the state of California, where I'm from, it is one of the greenest, first of all, it's the sixth largest economy in the world, and it's also one of the greenest environments. And the government of California for decades has been driving green legislation, and the outcome of that is job creation and economic prosperity, and that is undeniable. And so I think there are a lot of, whether it's California or other places around the world, that are certainly doing a lot to drive a healthy environment, and it's proving to be not just good for us from a wellness point of view, it's good from an economic point of view.
I think that itself might be the big driver of
Yeah.
standardizing and having measurements and goals that you need to meet. My question to you is, replicating it with
Exactly.
the changes which are required. So, for example, U.S. Green Building Council
Right.
has made some changes for my country, right? There is a USGBC standard for buildings there. Can you do that for cities? Can you have one standard and then modify it for regions?
Exactly. So that's what we try to do, learning from our buildings-related systems. And my background working in India and China and US and other countries quite a bit, what we try to do is to not standardize everything across the board, but have that flexibility, regional aspect of it. And we said, let's make that as a data discussion. So what all we talked in last few minutes is the premise that we are taking ahead and saying, how do we really work with cities in certifying them rather than standardizing them? Because now that discussion is a little different here.
Right.
We are saying, let's approach them where they are rather than telling them that meet this standard.
Absolutely.
No, because that's where the customization, because each city has their own unique challenge, and it's their own unique way in which to meet. So whether it's climate change and greenhouse gas emissions or water or anything, I mean, well-being we're talking about here. So I think that is where it's so subjective, and you started with that discussion. So being an urban planner, I'm like, okay, how do we really measure public health and safety or equitability or prosperity? And that's where you were talking about 5 parameters. We came up with 14 parameters, just 14 parameters, to compare world cities across the board, saying on all these aspects, I mean, yes, people can throw that through it and say, oh, you didn't include that parameter or that parameter, but that might be customizable to a city. We are saying, well, let's compare world cities on these 14 parameters. I think what Joshua was saying, and then let them choose and decide what they want to work on more. So we are offering them 250 more parameters to track their performance, compare themselves across the board. So that is the kind of data play. That is the kind of giving them flexibility to work on it, scalability, and at the same time recognizing that they are doing so much of good work. I mean, who are we to tell cities to do this? No, I think that's where their own challenges, they know it better than us. So that's the flexibility we are offering
Also,
here.
cities are starting at very different levels.
Exactly.
I mean, developing world, even though the urbanization process is the fastest in developing world and not the developed world right now, very, very different levels they are at. So my next question would be, can technology actually help the developing world to actually leapfrog? Like Songdo is a green city, but most of Indian cities have to be retrofitted. They're already bursting at their seams. So can technology bring about a narrowing of differences between some of the world's most, or cities which are very advanced and are very clued on and cued on to this whole concept of well-being and making their cities thrive, vis-a-vis cities in developing world like India, where we are starting literally at ground zero?
I think it's imperative, and I think it's going to happen out of necessity. It's like the old expression from William Gibson that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And what will happen is around the world, out of necessity, you will see innovation take place that will be, hopefully, a leading example for other parts of the world. You bring up what's happening in India. We're very engaged in India. We talked about this a bit last night in helping to drive cleaner air. We're working with Modi's office in a variety of cities around air quality, monitoring and management, and helping to inform policy making as well as urban planning around how to improve air quality in cities, which is, as you know, not just a major health issue, but it's also an economic issue because they're seeing real estate prices plummet in certain areas that are particularly plagued by poor air or water quality. And also looking at the Ganga and how can we help clean the Ganga. And it starts, of course, with measuring and then looking at what types of things can you take into account, leveraging technology to improve the water quality and the health of Indians.
All right, Mr. Tanaka.
Yeah, I'd like to just say that we're putting a lot of emphasis on data, which is correct. But what we also see is that at the end of the day, if you don't have the capacity, to essentially translate that data into actions and then those actions into implementation, you don't go the full loop, you don't achieve the impacts. So what we see is that to a certain extent we always need to be a bit careful, because when I hear, for example, the 250 criteria, I would say one thing from a practical side is, for example, our experience is very much, if you want to have an impact in a city, you need to work within the time frame of that mayor's being in position. Right? If you have a process that goes too long and gets to the conclusion a month before the election, you've basically, at least in many cases that we know, you've lost it, because you have to essentially restart, at the next cycle, because, particularly if the opposition, to that mayor wins, then he will, obviously, or she will, question, the data and question the conclusions and say, by the way, the priorities are different. So these are, essentially our approach, for example, on this Green Cities Action Plan is actually to be quite compact in the number of parameters that we look, in order to be able to move pretty quickly. And it goes in Howard's direction, being practical, achieve that one impact. It may not be the whole, but it's better to do, some demonstration, because once you have some demonstration, you can do much bigger things in the next step.
But well-being will be sum of parts. I mean, you will have to approach it. But then, you've raised a very important question. Who should be responsible? This is a problem faced globally by all cities. The mayor's tenure literally decides the direction that a city is taking for achieving any parameters of well-being or making it more future ready. And with the change in power, you also have sometimes a 360 shift in where that city is moving, and a lot is lost. You've been a civil servant. Tell us, who should be responsible for a city's well-being?
Well, it's always going to be complicated, isn't it? And I come from a federation, and in federations, the governance angle is particularly complicated. My colleagues and I used to often talk about local government in Australia as the part of government that actually worked, whereas the rest of us spent a lot of time arguing. That's probably a bit exaggerated, but I think there's one part of this that does need attention, because if you look at the research, it shows that cities can do their own thing very effectively, and they can leapfrog over problems that confound national governments. But it probably helps cities, particularly if we're talking about standards, if they work with a national government. So I think there's a shared responsibility, but for any city, that responsibility always attaches in part to the national government.
All right, so you start at the city level, but you have to have a buy-in from the national government. Are we saying that?
Yeah, I think so. And then there are many champions. So it depends who is the champion in the city for that purpose is very important. For setting that standard, at the same time data discussion, at the same time implementation. Because that championship can come from many different aspects. People have various authorities that they can exercise and do it. But it depends how they do it and also in concert with that. But you touched upon technology discussion. So I would want to cut back to that discussion about technology. So in our world, you're talking about India and China, and right now we are here in Sangdo. So I had been working with cities for the last roughly 18, 19 years in different capacities, and have seen a lot of eco-cities discussion, smart cities discussion. I must say, yesterday I visited Songdo Operation Center and all, and it needs to be regarded. I mean, I really respect Commissioner Lee's leadership in getting these things done. It's amazing. I also respect Gail, POSCO, and the partners like Arup and KPF in working this thing done in such a short time,
Yes.
putting all these things together and having people enjoy that quality of life. So big applause to you all. And we are fortunate as US Green Building Council to be working with Songdo IBD to be certified as the first lead for cities, lead for communities, community. And we are hoping to have that announcement pretty soon, probably this evening or tomorrow morning. So it's a great pleasure for us to work with such a proactive city and the community. So technology becomes a big part of it. And they were exhibiting yesterday how they are trying to bring together technology to talk about safety, to talk about accidents, to talk about air quality, and then how they can implement it and all. So I think it's very integral. As Jonathan was saying, technology is the forefront. But as Joshua and Mr. Bamsey said, how do we really integrate these things into implementation is a big thing. So each city will have their own priority, but implementing it and understanding the data trends to implement better things is the key part of the whole discussion.
Yeah. I mean, just to make a point here that in practical terms, again, I talked about mayoral terms. Okay, this is very much, I would say, fruit of experience. But the other one is a sector approach, yes. Right? Because essentially, if you're talking about buildings, you know, I was in Beijing yesterday at the Clean Energy Ministerial. Okay, there was a whole roundtable on buildings and what is the role of national governments and cities in buildings. It's a very complicated area. You know, if you look into transport, you know, you get into another subworld, right, in which the relationships between national and, you know, local are yet different. Each country has different ways of giving means to cities financially, right? So some countries, actually cities, have quite a level of decision-making that they can make. In other countries, none. Everything depends on the center. So this is where I would say we can have a frame, we can have the standards that we started our conversation on, but then the game has many dimensions, and you need to understand the dimensions of each country and each city within those countries to resolve and bring solutions.
So do you think a body like NewCities Foundation could come out with a global framework? Jonathan, would you like to take that question? Is it possible, leaving enough room for adaptation at city level?
I was just, the same thought was going through my head as I was listening to Josué speak. I think we need leadership at a global level that can bring cities together to help define standards, to help drive the cross-pollination of best practices so that we can, as I said,
make a start.
Make a start.
You have to have a, one framework for measuring city well-being. I think the start has to be made somewhere. That's an important part. In terms of responsibility, yes, of course, the buck has to stop with probably the mayor if cities do have a mayor system. In some cities, it's the civil servant who pretty much holds the city, appointed by the government. Complicated in terms of whether it's national government or a city government. Funding will decide a lot as well, who holds the power. What about citizens themselves? How do you get them more involved in, do you think like a competition across the globe? Because you have a Gallup index of well-being right now. Whenever it comes out, there are cities who don't rank well and they get very upset about it and they say, hey, but like we mentioned, this is a parameter, we don't even fit into it. And then a city like London will lose its ranking because of 2 attacks, and they will also have an issue around it. So is there a way that you can actually get cities and the citizens to participate in the standardization process? Mr. Bamsey?
Well, I think again, it'll depend on the city and the system, but most cities these days do have means to, they can do it if there's what we sometimes call enough political will. And by that I mean if those who are governing the city at the highest level want the input and ask for it, almost every city will have the means to acquire it. And they'll ask for it if the citizens are interested. So I think there's an exchange going on, and the effectiveness of that exchange will vary. But again, I think I keep aggregating when we talk about well-being. We talk about standards. I keep coming up at higher levels. Josué mentioned benchmarking. I think it's an important tool. It's a tool for measuring and improving citizens' engagement as much as it is for comparing, sewerage effectiveness. I think if you keep looking sideways, you're going to promote a sense of positive competition amongst cities that will help them. So your question was, can NewCities Foundation help and provide the leadership that Jonathan was talking about? I don't know the answer to that, but there's certainly potential.
You bring up a great point, which is competition. And I think it may not be acute yet, but with a growing population, economic issues around the world, cities will more and more compete with each other for business, for citizens. Yeah, exactly. And in order to do that, they will need to be able to have wellness as a basic foundation of livability in those cities.
And that is, sorry.
Please.
And that is what we all look for, right? If at all I'm deciding whether I want to be in Long Island near New York, or if I want to be in Mumbai or near Paris, work is available, but livability is more important. And so I think that is a key part of it. And nowadays with, we all are becoming quite aware about what we do, how we do it, using smart technologies and all. Phones are always there. So I think point is that if at all a proper engagement is done and people are invited to get involved in a proper way, I think people will get involved.
They will.
And they have their ways in suggesting what they want and how they want it.
Yes.
Even in India, in China, here, we have seen that people want to contribute to all these discussions. I mean, in Africa, there are so many instances where if they have their way, they will find out how to get things done. So I think involving people is the key, basic most activity that we all do. I mean, all these multilateral agencies have been doing. But I think finding out new ways of engaging them is the key part of it.
Yeah,
I think competition always does that.
Yeah.
Well, there is competition, and then another word with Sean at the end, which is essentially building participation in the processes that you do in terms of defining the priorities, consultation, another word with TION at the end, in terms of the specific project. Now, I would also say that one of the things too is that, with participation also comes quote-unquote responsibility, and sometimes these things don't always go the same way, right? Because everybody wants to have Class A services, but you essentially need cost recovery in order to do. And at that point, if you deal with any rate change or something in any city, generally city councils will not like that. And so managing that balance is also part of getting things done.
Oh, don't we know that? In my country, user charges are just the toughest.
Yeah.
And there are 100 smart cities ready to take off, not having a clue in terms of where will the monies come from.
That's right.
But, I know I'm one-dimensional in a sense about climate change, but there's some new research from the Commission on the New Climate Economy that demonstrates that cities could save about $1.7 trillion if they planned effectively for the impacts of climate change and for reducing emissions in cities. So that helps fund the services you want. If you can, energy efficiency is the most obvious and simplest way to find the savings quickly, and then you've got the resources you need to meet the aspirations that people have.
That's correct.
Yeah, but that's a very, very strong argument to start there.
Start small, low-hanging fruit.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to conclude by just asking a fun question, which is, which city would you rate very high currently on well-being, or would you like to live in?
Well, I'm biased. I live in San Francisco, one of the greatest food cities in the world, so I'm
You're quite happy there.
I'm loyal to my stomach, but I have the opportunity to travel around the world, so I get to participate in all of the wonderful things that many cities have to offer, and I think you can find wonderful wellness-related and other aspects of all of the great cities.
Mr. Bamsey, what about you? Pick a
Well,
city for us.
we live in Songdo, but one of our staff went to Melbourne a few weeks ago.
Yes.
And we thought for a while, I had to keep calling her because we thought for a while she wasn't going to come back. And there's a long tradition, including my daughter, of people who go to Melbourne just for a little while and never come back. So I think I'd probably have to nominate Melbourne.
I know. In fact, Economist Intelligence Unit, their livability index ranked Melbourne as #1. So there has to be a reason that no wonder people don't want to come back.
Yeah.
Well,
Mr.
I would have
Tanaka?
to give you an answer that reflects my own background, right? In the sense that I was born in Paris. I studied in New York, in the States. My father came from Japan. My family lives in Rio. So I would have to give you an answer that is essentially to enjoy the diversity of the cities that we have. That probably no one single city has it all. Right, and therefore, that's what makes it interesting. That you need to go around and enjoy, the different aspects of urban well-being as they are interpreted in different parts of the world.
Okay.
I couldn't agree more with Joshua's discussion because that's where I was thinking about. I couldn't put finger on one city or the other. So I think all cities are at different stages of their moving towards the best city for themselves and for attracting businesses as well as minds together. I think point is to really look into it from a perspective of our own priorities or businesses' priorities and all. And I think that is where it makes more sense to evaluate that city for that point of time and understanding the parameters, what is important for me.
Very diplomatic answers. That's not what I was looking for.
Anybody
wants to
your
hang?
answer?
Oh, my answer. I definitely do not want to live in New Delhi, but unfortunately, like you said, business priority. As a journalist, that's the place I will get a job. We could do with a lot of improvement. Ideally, I would want to kick off everything, every city, and go and live in Goa next to a beach.
Come to Long Island.
Yeah, not a bad one. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this session. I'm opening the floor for questions. Anybody? Amazing panel here. We've all agreed that yes, we need standardization of well-being, and we need a framework. It has to be a flexible framework. It cannot be a very hardline framework because then cities will not be able to, match those goals or those, destinations that they set for themselves. Having said that, anybody has a question, please? Yes, please.
We've had 2 sessions now on urban well-being, and I think the one word that I didn't hear that in my mind is significantly important is affordability. I think cities need to be affordable so they become diverse in its economic status, and they don't become bastions of the rich or what have you. And I think that in the future, successful cities, cities that have this good urban well-being, with all the other things that were said, will need to be affordable.
Absolutely. We did kind of just mention equitable growth in passing, but I take that point. It's a really important one. Yes.
So my observation is a livable city where we can create access to pedestrian. Because you can see that we are talking about high technology in terms of mobility, transportation, but most of the cities in India, you can see people walk. But where is the accessibility to go to the market in terms of business places? Secondly, about the public places, parks, playgrounds.
Open spaces.
Open spaces. So that is my submission.
Absolutely.
So if I just respond very quickly, I think you have hit a very key note here because accessibility not only from that point of view, but accessibility to water. I mean, I come from India as well. Water, energy, and affordable means of accessing these things are very useful. So accessibility in a larger sense is very, very useful. And right now, we are very seriously considering to add an element of accessibility in all the parameters that we consider. So couldn't agree more. Thank you for raising that point.
Yes.
We as human beings have destroyed our environment, and we are also responsible for creating all these problems in our cities. And these human settlements problems are brought about because, first of all, we were not concerned about our well-being, right? So the question was that if we had to come up with solutions to our problems, I think we have to revert back first to nature and include all the flora and fauna, the ecosystem that goes with the environment. Instead of us trying to come up with hand-picked solutions to problems that we created ourselves. And these continuing problems will always arise because people would have different culture, different language, different ways of doing things, which eventually destroys the environment and the whole planet. We are now at the verge of creating this disturbance of probably eliminating the human race from the planet. And it's happening. Coastal cities would be subjected to sea level rising, as the indications are showing now that temperature has changed. And ice in the Antarctic is melting, and a lot of these glaciers are disappearing. So there is an imperative need for us to look into it in the same way as we give the cities the opportunity to solve their problem, but I think the media has a bigger role in education and letting people know, instead of just projecting news of what terrorism is all about. Maybe we should go into the noble concept of the media providing education to the people. In that way, we should learn how to live with the environment and live with our ways of...
As a representative of media, I would take that feedback very seriously. Yes, agree that all our screens are, dominated with breaking news, and negative news probably makes much bigger news than driving people towards a change. Having said that, we are doing it, and...
one point, two. One is, I think, since we are here in the presence of Howard, I think the point on climate change is absolutely key. It's a macro element. But the other point I'd like to make is I think it's a word that we use that's very à la mode, which in practice is not always easy, the famous leapfrogging word, right? Because to a large extent, what we observe is that you do have a cycle in cities these days, in development terms, right? That generally the front end is development at all costs, right? And that leads to a lot of the environmental issues that the gentleman mentioned. And then once it gets to a certain level, you start seeing that people start, quote unquote, seeing the consequences of what has happened, and you start having, therefore, action that start happening on the environmental front. So the big question is, can we avoid that early stage, right? And that one, I'm afraid I don't have the answer yet. We try to, but it's not so easy.
I think we know theoretically we can, and we know some of the things that we can do. And it is, to a large extent, a question of directing your investment so that you can harvest two things simultaneously. You can harvest ecosystems that prosper and people who prosper. It isn't rocket science, but it's at least as difficult to do as building a rocket in practice.
And bringing all the stakeholders together, because when we are doing it, one or the other stakeholder group will get left out, knowingly or unknowingly. And that is the kind of challenges that the gentleman up there mentioned. So I think that is where our interest is to bring everybody on board, but it's really hard to really assure
You
it.
can leapfrog.
Exactly.
I mean, that is why when a country like India signs on to Paris Agreement, I mean, as a country, we've not been big contributors, but as we grow, we will become big contributors to greenhouse emissions, and we need to leapfrog. For example, in renewables, in solar energy, we have now the latest bidding, the rates fell below thermal energy.
Yeah.
So we can leapfrog to solar much before anybody else can.
And I was leaving from New York on Monday, and in New York Times front page, discussion is about India's solar targets. And that's amazing. I mean, to see it on New York Times front page, it's remarkable.
In rupees and paisa, 2 rupees 45 paisa was shocking. It made headlines.
I agree.
So yes, we are, and point well taken. We should. Some of those points do make it to the front page of New York Times and also on Indian news.
The central government in India, the Prime Minister is now saying that India will do better than the commitments it took to Paris.
Yes,
He's not saying that just because of the climate. He's saying that because he knows it's good for well-being in India and for the economy.
Absolutely.
And I think the previous government had good targets on deploying solar, but he tenfolded those targets as he came in. That was quite amazing. When he did that, we all were like laughing around it. It's not possible, but at least right now we see the progress, and we all feel good about it. So I think Ashok yesterday was mentioning about a dreamer, and we need a dreamer. There are so many people to sell that dream, but we need a dreamer who can really dream big. So I think with that...
on that positive note, having many dreamers, let me conclude this. Thank you, Vatsal Bhatt, Mr. Tanaka, Mr. Bamsey, and Jonathan. Pleasure having you on this panel and this discussion.
Thanks, Manisha.
Excellent. Thank you.